So we've been treated today to an enormous amount of expertise on the part of those who've been using quantitative techniques to try and understand such things as price, OPEC behavior, demand, and supply. My topic is almost the opposite of these things, which is the thoughts of particularly our political leaders about the oil market. So in simplest form, I could say that there's a real oil market with which you all are familiar and with which you to which you apply your quantitative tools. Political leaders listen to advice from some selection of experts, and my story is the story of how that expert advice has been given and how it's interacted with some economic cycles. So let's see if I can use this device here. Great. So I'm going to direct your attention, if I can, to the area on this side of World War I. That's really my topic, because that's the age of oil. I do want to point out that there have been some great cycles in American economic history. They tend to, we have a situation in which wars tend, but do not absolutely coincide with peaks in commodity prices. This is not a very fashionable topic in social science, and it turns out that there are a couple of very important wars that have nothing at all to do with these peaks. Nonetheless, what revealed itself to me when I first saw this chart, which was provided to me, the labels are mine, but the data is from Stifel Nicholas, is that forecasts of impending oil scarcity correspond pretty tightly with these troughs in the commodity cycle. So with that in mind, I want to look a little more particularly at what I'm calling the oil scarcity syndrome. So the oil scarcity syndrome, to me, is a pattern within this greater commodity price cycle. And in it, we tend to see money growth preceding a peak, or at least a peak oil forecast in these troughs. There's been some money growth. A feeling in the political realm takes hold that we have to get foreign oil because we're going to run out of it. And that is often followed, not in all cases, but by price controls in the domestic economy. We're talking about the US economy here. Then, most often, there's a war. The purpose of the war has not been for oil. We have a peak in oil price, often coinciding with some development of a new resource or the bursting of a credit bubble. As price collapses, domestic producers clamor to keep foreign oil out. In many, but not all cases, we see tariffs and quotas, sometimes domestic production rationing. And the great paradox of the oil scarcity syndrome, as I see it, is that interventionist policies are adopted at the very end of this cycle. So the momentum comes from this forecast of scarcity. We've got to have the oil. The belief that we've got to have the oil survives a glut. And we have an interventionist policy that's adopted almost in spite of what would seem to be contrary economic evidence. So this is just a quick introduction of the idea that monetary growth, this is a 10-year moving average, seems to precede oil price increases. Not true in all cases, This is the Great Depression and the East Texas oil find kind of corresponded to create what I think was a dip in what would otherwise maybe have been a flat curve here. Nonetheless, we see this, particularly when before the Second World War, which was a war quite different from all others in that so much of it was financed by monetary expansion as opposed to debt or taxes. I hope these labels are visible because there's an awful lot going on in this slide. So I'm going to take you through this commodity price cycle. There's no oil prices on this slide, but just to show, again, how this cycle seems to me to be repeating itself in history. So we have a peak oil forecast, in this case by the U.S. Geological Survey, beginning in 1908. These proceed for another 10 years. At a real trough, at least in PPI energy. I want to thank again Stifel Nicholas for doing the tedious work for me of putting all of this into panel data form. All through this period, as commodity prices, including energy prices, are rising steeply, we have an increasing amount of controls in the domestic economy, on transportation, on informal controls on prices. The president is convinced in 1919, he reveals in a letter to an aide, I don't know where we're going to find the oil for the future. And that where turns out to be the Middle East. So the perceived need for Middle East oil then leads to the American quest for a share in the spoils of the Ottoman Empire. We have what then is going to become a long glut in commodity prices, particularly energy prices. And I'll go over this World War I period in a great deal more detail because it's probably the one least familiar to all of you. But again, we have peak oil forecasts, again, coming from a different Department of the Interior office in this case. In the 1937 and 1940 period, we have a commodity price spike pretty high during World War II. Nothing like, however, increase in money supply. In this case, the PPI energy index doesn't spike far above all other commodities in World War II, and there's some particular reasons for that. But notice again that we had in this period of decline is when we have the Iran coup, and of course the coup, which I think is probably the most, maybe the largest mistake in American foreign policy history. The Iran coup takes place when President Eisenhower overrules the logic of the Truman administration, which is, well, what do we care if Iran wants a 50-50 deal in oil, or if they want, if Iran wants to nationalize its oil? Oil continued to flow from us from Mexico, said President Truman. It will do so from Iran if Iran nationalizes its oil, or if we give them a 50-50 deal. President Eisenhower simply didn't like that idea, and he was willing to support this coup against Iran. But moving on, price controls did come into effect in 1971, as Dr. Al-Haji points out, but it wasn't just oil price that was spiking. It was all commodities and energy. Again, this is coal and oil, not just energy, not just oil. Even exceeded the PPI, all commodities index. Two very important interventionist policies, the one by President Nixon, I think even more important than the Carter Doctrine of 1980. President Nixon in March of 1974, as I learned watching television one day, Secretary Kissinger delivered a threat to the king that he would seize the oil if only the oil embargo were not lifted. Saudi production, in fact, had been rising for the last 2 months. simply because of this problem of cartel cohesion that Dr. Haji alluded to. So essentially the embargo was over, and the political leadership was out of touch, sufficiently out of touch with this to threaten basically an ally with a sovereign violation to seize the resource. The Carter Doctrine basically reiterated this, formalized this idea that the U.S. would defend Persian Gulf oil against basically what was anticipated to be Soviet takeover. The collapse of commodity prices did nothing to convince the Reagan administration that this oil resource didn't need military protection. So we've now gone from a red line agreement in 1928, which at least in terms of American intervention in the Middle East, not especially consequential, to this, which is something very much more at the real bottom in a commodity cycle. So this, and 5-year moving averages in this case.